As I said, this is an overview. On our site and on other places, we have hour-and-a-half presentations just on related laws and authorities, such as floodplain and soil preservation. So this should just give you a little primer, if you will, and a nice foundation to get started. Before I start, how many people have done an environmental review before? Okay. Environmental assessment. Everybody say numbers. EIS. Anybody? Environmental impact statement is what that is. I'm sorry. We'll get into the terminology a little bit later. But after this, you should understand what is the National Environmental Policy Act, different levels of review, different red flags that can result in either sanctions, waivers, or projects being made ineligible under disaster assistance or other titles for the remainder of the life of that property. And also we'll show you a few tools and give you some context. The foundation of the environmental review process is the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969. It was signed by President Nixon actually in 1970. It is mainly a procedural piece of legislation, but from it comes the other executive orders and related laws that we'll talk about throughout this. Basically, because it's procedural, it's very important that you show your work and keep all of your stuff documented, even if you have a FONSI or find out that it's exempt. We're going to do an environmental study, or what they call an environmental review record, or ERR. It is a public document. You should not keep it in a safe away from the community. And you're going to want to get all this information prior to making the finalized decision that you are going to choose a site and how you're going to do it. Otherwise, the process is bankrupt and empty, and you are making it a worthless exercise. One of the key components of 24 CFR 58, which is HUD's environmental regulations, is that a chief elected official, whether it's a mayor, city manager, or mayor, city manager, I guess a judge down here, they have to sign off on the review. This is basically required because HUD is the only federal agency that allows states, local governments, and local, state, county, local, city, to do the federal environmental review. While DOT does allow states, we're the only ones that allow locals. And to do this, we have to have the local assume all of the federal court jurisdiction. And that's what they're signing off on, and saying that instead of waiting for HUD to do the review, which you don't want to do, we are going to do it ourselves and assume all of the responsibilities that come with that. So once an applicant applies for assistance, or that you've documented that you're going to consider financing a site, you must make sure that there is no further activity, no construction, no nothing. There are certain cases with contracts that can come up that are previously executed, but that gets dicey, and we can talk about that on an individual basis. The big thing to note is that neither the applicant nor any partners, so if you're working with the state, a different government, or a nonprofit, or a private entity, they all must stop, because even non-federal funds cannot be spent. If they're still spending non-federal funds in the project, you're going to have to come in for a waiver. You have to talk to me for a few months, and it's not going to be a fun process. A lot of information you get from initial project screening may help prevent you from getting entangled in an elaborate environmental review process. Most of you probably know if there's a major Superfund site in your community, or where the floodways or high velocity zones are. And from that, you should also be able to know if their budget is realistic. If they're going to have to elevate 12 feet above the ground, that's going to cost a substantial amount of money, and you should consider that in your funding allocations. When you identify the project, you're going to also look at scope. That goes into what is called aggregation, and I'll define that more later. Look at all the different types of activities and try to put them all into one environmental review record when possible. And when you know the location, one of the first things you want to do is look at the maps. You want to look at your local planning maps. your wetlands, floodplain maps, and any historical maps that you may have. It should be pretty readily available and will give you a good idea of some of the bigger pitfalls that may occur. Okay, back to what I was talking about, aggregation. Aggregation is basically the principle that you cannot just cut a project piecemeal. Say you're financing an alley or a road, and only 30% of it's federal funding. You can't just say the first 30 feet are the federal road and the next 70 is the private road, and then just cherry pick the easier side to review. When you get to more complicated ones, you're going to use what is called the but-for principle. It's but for the rest of the project or the federal funding, would this project make sense? So to just have a couple feet of asphalt out there, that would not make much sense. And the courts actually use that kind of analysis to determine if you've done what's called segmentation, which is basically cherry picking different aspects of a project. Like there's been cases where people have said, we're just doing the windows on this new construction. Well, it's like, but for the rest of that building, would you need a stack of windows over there in that property? And the answer is usually no. So while some of them are common sense, a lot of them can be tricky, and feel free to contact your local field environmental officer or regional environmental officer if you need a little guidance on that. Another way to go about it, and this is especially helpful when you're doing a lot of single-family rehabs, is to do what is called a neighborhood target review. We did a lot for the neighborhood stabilization program too. It basically, you can take an entire census tract and do an environmental review on all of it. You can do a floodplain analysis and say that where there is substantial improvement, you're going to elevate to the base flood elevation, you're going to buy your flood insurance, and that's just going to be our plan. And then you can find the individual sites later, but you already have the basis of what's already pretty much a review done. And you're also going to have proof of your flood insurance later, but we'll get to that. And if anyone's interested in that, we do have some memos and guidance on that to help walk you through it and set it up for you. Now, the different level of reviews. The most intensive level review is Environmental Impact Statement, or EIS. It's triggered by regulations by 2,500 units or 2,500 beds in a hospital. Or if it's infrastructure, it's 2,500, or capacity for 2,500 potential units. So even if you're doing, say, a wastewater treatment plant or something, and it's not hitting 2,500 units yet, it's just at 2,400. If it has the ability and capacity to go up to 2,500, you've just triggered an EIS. There are some other exceptions that come up. It's called extraordinary circumstances. It's really rare. One example I can think of is we had a dam that was failing, and they wanted to do a rehab program. And they're like, well, it passed the review because a failing dam is not listed in HUD's regulations. Well, we had to tell them that's an extraordinary circumstances because that is indeed a threat to the human environment. So sometimes there are common sense ways to get through things like this, and this is basically the most intensive and the biggest study you have to do. Right below that is the environmental assessment. It includes all of the related laws such as floodplain management, wetlands, historic preservation, toxics, but also requires that you do the environmental assessment checklist, which includes looking at things such as slope, site design, ground soil support, schools, hospitals, garbage, sewage capacity, just all the other infrastructure-related and capacity issues that would affect the human environment. Directly below that, we have categorically excluded properties, and they are basically categorically excluded from NEPA itself, but they are still subject to the related laws, such as historic preservation, wetlands, floodplains, executive order, noise, etc. Below that, we have categorically excluded, not subject to. These are basically ones that you're not going to have to do the NEPA process, and you're not going to have to do the executive orders, but you will have to look at the 58.6 related laws, which I'll get into, which are flood insurance, COBRA, coastal barrier resources, and runway clear zone. And then the last category is exempt, and it's basically the same thing. And a lot of people ask me, Jeremiah, why do we have a category who are not subject to and exempt? Well, it's because of the weird relationship HUD has where we allow locals to do the review. We're saying that they're exempt from the enabling statute that requires local governments to do that. And also, it's just general counsel likes to be confusing, and it's just something they can hold over your head. No, but anyway, it's effectively the same thing, and just know that. Exempt activities are 24 CFR Part 58.34A. These are basically just soft costs. Going to have your environmental planning and design costs. The environmental review itself could be funded under this. Basic information, financial services, public services such as after-school programs, any inspections, management costs. These are basically activities that will not move a spade of dirt or impact the ground or environment in any way. Oh, it also includes temporary assistance for imminent threats. This comes up at times too. If you have a building that is about to literally fall onto the sidewalk and kill people, we'd let you get away with not doing the environmental review for something like that because you are indeed protecting the human environment by doing such an activity. There are several hoops to go through. We have guidance memos on it. You can't just say, well, the plumbing doesn't work, so it's not up to code, and then say I don't have to do an environmental review. It has to literally be a hazard to not just occupants, but people in the public. And if you ever need guidance on that, we can supply you with a memo and further technical assistance. Some of the categorically exempt activities that are not subject to, which is essentially the same as exempt, like I stated earlier, are tenant-based rental assistance. That's not considered to be a federal action because the tenant is actually making the decision on where to spend the federal funds, so it insulates the government, therefore it's not a federal action. That's the whole principle behind that one. The other ones are pretty much the same as soft costs, just more supported services, utility costs, non-construction designs, all your pre-development, and also supplemental assistance. So if you've done a review for a project and funded it once, as long as all of the findings and evidence that you have from the prior review are still valid, you can add that on and get away with, you don't have to actually do another review, essentially. These are the categorically excluded subject to. Again, this is where you have to do your floodplain, wetlands, HP, everything else. Applies to public facilities where you're not increasing capacity by 20% or more. Any actions that are giving mobility assistance to the disabled or handicapped. We have a single family where you're not increasing the footprint and the land use isn't changed. We're trying to actually change that regulation now to get rid of the footprint requirement, but that public comment just ended on that, and the final rule hopefully will be coming out. Again, minor rehab for multifamily, which is similar to the public facilities one, and the non-residential, again, you have the density threshold, and then acquisition and disposition where you're not changing use. So for the NEPA portion of the review, you're going to use it to determine if there's any significant impacts that would trigger an EIS, which is the environmental impact study. And an EIS is generally something that you will only want to do when necessary. They usually take, if you're lucky, less than a year, and if it's really thin, it'll only be 800 pages, but it can go to thousands and thousands of pages. So for your larger scale projects, I suggest you get started early if you think you're going to trigger the 2,500 threshold and try to avoid extraordinary circumstances such as failing dams. This is the environmental process in chart form. It just lists your exempt and CADEX activities. Note that the same outcome is for both. You're not going to have to publish or do a request for release of funds, but you are going to have to just have a single document that says we found this to be either exempt or CADEX subject to, and then cite whatever the regulation is that you declared it. Because sometimes you can get into weird areas where you're not sure if it's maintenance or operating costs. I mean, sometimes you can just put both, just so whenever someone, if they challenge it or if we're monitoring, we know what your thought process was, and you can show your work to prove that you did your due diligence. And again, these are the CADEX, and we'll go into comment periods later. So for public notification, again, exempt CADEX, you have none. When there's CADEX subject to, and you go through all the related laws, so you find out there's no wetland, no floodplain, it's not historic, basically got a clean bill of health environmentally, you can then convert that over to exempt, and you don't have to publish those, and you don't have to do your notice of intent and request for release of funds. Now, if something's triggered, then you have to do that. And if it's an EA, you have to combine and do the FONSI and the notice of intent to request. And the comment periods for the two come in two phases. The first is the local entity is going to publish and say that in 15 days we're going to send our request of release of funds to HUD, send any comments about this project to us. And then after those 15 days, if you publish in the newspaper, and 18 if you post in a post office, you go and you send it to HUD, and then they hold it for another 15 days and wait for additional public comments. And then after that, you'll get a notice. It's called an AUGF, an authority to use grant funds. And these forms are, if you ever want to look for them, are Form 7015.15 and 7015.16. Actually, you don't need 16. That's on our side. But I guess some states may do it. But you guys are all direct grantees, right? But I think I'll do the questions at the end, just because I've been bogged down before. But after just doing a notice of intent for the CADEX subject to, it's just going to be 7 days for that. Okay, and remember I said earlier, even if you're exempt or your CADEX not subject to, you have to do your 58.6 related laws. These are them. The first one is flood insurance. So if it's a building that you're doing any type of work on, you have to insure that. And also if you're buying certain type of insurable contents, like say water pumps or other types of related heavy equipment that isn't that movable, you want to insure that as well. This is a separate requirement. It's required under the Flood Disaster Protection Act and not under the Executive Order 11988 for floodplain protection. And there will be many cases where you will not have to do the 8-step process under the executive order, but you will have to still maintain flood insurance. For instance, for single-family rehabs, it comes up a lot. Okay. And we just keep repeating to buy flood insurance. It's a good deal when you can't afford it. But and I should note that you could buy private flood insurance, but I've yet to see a private insurer that has undercut FEMA. And actually most private insurers require that you get private flood insurance up to the maximum of $250,000 for residential and $500,000 non-residential. And then they will, if you wanted to insure past those limits, which is not required, but if you did, they would just put filler on top of that, and they'll get you the 500 to 600 or however high up you want to go. But it's usually pretty expensive. The duration is different for loans and grants. For loans, it's just for the amount and the term of the loan. So say you have a $20,000 loan you put up there. So the first year, while there's still a $20,000 outstanding balance, you have to maintain flood insurance for $20,000. They pay off $4,000 the next year. You only have to maintain $16,000 worth of flood insurance. You just basically have to insure the outstanding principal. So if a flood occurs, you get the federal dollars back per loan. Now for a grant, it's the amount of the total financial assistance, not just the federal assistance, but the entire amount of assistance that was used. So if you're combining different funds from different pots, you'll have to insure that entire amount so long as that structure has economic value. And there are some issues with economic value that come up in disaster. Say if you're doing buyouts, you're going to demolish, you wouldn't have to insure that if you know you're not going to use it and you've declared it to have no economic value. We don't want you to have to spend your funds to insure properties that you want to get rid of anyway. And this is kind of the teeth of the mandatory purchase principle, and it's exclusive to disaster assistance, so you should put a star by this one because it can really bite you. God, bad pun, I didn't even mean that. It basically says that if you receive disaster assistance and you were required to maintain flood insurance, and for some reason you did not, another disaster occurs and hits that property, you cannot get disaster assistance for that next disaster. You had your one bite, you didn't maintain your flood insurance, you're done, you can never get disaster assistance again for that structure. There are several ways to monitor and ensure this. You can use covenants, you can also get notice of any changes in the policy by having your agency listed as one of the contacts on the flood insurance application. I should have put a picture of the actual policy in here. I do have it in my longer floodplain presentation, but basically there's a box that has it says mortgagee, like the banks will get notified if you don't get your flood insurance maintained because they have an interest in making sure that that property is being paid off. But also there's a line for second, mortgagee, and other, and you can put your agency in there. And you will automatically get notice if they're either delinquent, cancel their policy, or degrade it. You'll get the same notice a bank would in that situation. And it's just an easy way to keep on top of it without having to somehow get them to cough up information. And you can make that a condition of the grant assistance too, that they include you on the insurance application. Some of the other authorities under 58.6 that apply to everything is COBRA. It's Coastal Barrier Resources Act. It basically says that if you're in a unit that's declared to be a coastal barrier resource by the Congress, you cannot use financial assistance there to develop and build. Then the other one is runway clear zones. It's basically you can't build in the area at the end of a runway. I know you may ask, like, why would anyone do that? It seems nonsensical, but you'd be surprised. It's usually pretty cheap land for some reason, and you'll probably have some noise issues with it as well, but it's just something to be aware of. Okay, and these are the related laws I was mentioning. They're all listed at 24 CFR 58.5. The ones I'm going to focus on today, because they seem to come up more often in disaster assistance scenarios, are historic preservation, floodplain management, wetlands, and toxic hazards. Historic preservation is a consultation process. It's usually triggered by a structure or building being over 50 years of age or in a historic district. If it's triggered, you're going to want to contact your SHPO, and you'll either get a letter from them saying, hey, we want to consult you on this, we think it's historic, and then they give you conditions, and you'll enter this whole process that is very long, elaborate, and frankly I'm not an expert in, but we have someone if you get into a dicey one. Or they'll give you a letter saying that they're not interested in it, it's not historic, they're like, hey, that's a 12-year-old trailer, we don't want to talk about it. Or they just 3 days will pass and they won't talk to you. And if they don't get to you in 30 days, you can just move on. Another element of the Historic Preservation Act is I was about to fall off the stage there. Sorry. It's a long way up here. Another element is tribal consultation. You must consult with any tribes that may have interest in archaeological issues in the area. We have a tool called the Tribal Directory Assessment Tool. There's so many terms that just roll off the tongue. I mean, aren't you guys just really feeling it now? It's a long day, yeah. All right, but it's a pretty easy tool. It lists state by state and county by county any tribes that would be interested. Basically, send them a similar letter, and we have form letters to help you out. They're similar to SHPO, and the same rules apply. If they consult with you, you will have to consult with them. If they say they're not interested, you move on. If 30 days pass and you hear nothing but crickets, you can move on. Another authority is Executive Order 11988, Floodplain Management. It comes to play a lot in disasters, as you are probably sure of. This is my particular authority that I'm charged with coordinating our environmental officers with. The basic principle is to avoid whenever you can, minimize if you must build in the floodplain, and if you must build, you must bring in the public. Here's an example of a way you would have to minimize some structures. It's a lot of exercise, I'm sure. All right, and this is the decision-making process. It's a little small, but we have a website where you can get a bigger chart. On the right is some flooding that occurred in Alaska. But the chart looks somewhat complex there. It's not nearly as bad as, for instance, the historic preservation chart, which looks like some kind of hieroglyphic that I will never understand. Let's see. These are reactions where you typically have to do an 8-step. Rehabs where you have what's called substantial damage or require substantial improvement. That means that over 50% of the value of the structure has been diminished through the disaster. And when that happens, you're not going to be able to use the 5512 or 5512B8 or B2 exemption for minor improvement of 1 to 4 family homes. It also means that you're going to have to elevate under the National Flood Insurance Program. So you should consider that when you're looking at buildings that are heavily destroyed, because a lot of times if it's up to 70% destroyed, it's almost better to do a buyout than take what's left of it and try to elevate something that's way below the base flood. Again, it also applies to multifamily buildings, which we consider to be over 5 units. The 5-unit threshold is something that came to be through the FHA. It's just stuck ever since. Any roads, pipelines, and basically any soil disturbance that is more than just landscaping and maintenance, or minor clearing and grubbing. This is also something to think about in terms of impacts. If you say that you want to avoid a lot of mandatory purchase requirements and maintaining flood insurance, so I'm just going to go and fill the land and put all these properties on top of a bunch of dirt to make them technically above the base flood elevation. And if you do that, FEMA will give you a letter of map revision, and then they'll say mandatory purchase doesn't apply. But just know that when you do that, you are how do I say this? Jeopardizing the accuracy of your current flood insurance rate maps, because FEMA is not actually considering the impacts off-site. So if you're filling large pieces of area in the floodplain, you are in fact spreading your floodplain. Think about if you have a 3/4 full bathtub and you put an object that's half as big as the bathtub in there. All of a sudden your water level is raising. And FEMA is not updating their maps every time you're filling these properties. So you're just going to want to be aware of this. And there's actually case law out there where people have filled large developments with dirt and pushed other people into harm's way because they were on the flood fringe. And they've won judgments against those developers for that development because they, in fact, were liable for the flooding that occurred. So if you can't avoid, you're going to want to limit fill when possible because you're going to want to keep the accuracy of your maps to a degree. Sometimes fill may be the yes option. I mean, that's up to you to decide. You're going to minimize grading whenever possible by using pervious surfaces and or minimize grading and use pervious surfaces. You don't want to compact too much dirt because then it makes it less likely to absorb a lot of water, and if you have large parking lots, you're actually preventing that soil from absorbing any of the water. So it actually goes around the edges, and you also have stormwater issues. It's just a nightmare. If possible, they have different types of pavement now. Some of it is kind of like a sponge-like material where the water can go directly through. Some are just more like bricks, and the water can go around into the seams. Sometimes they are more expensive, typically they are, but typically they last longer. So you may want to look at long-term costs if you can, and if that's a viable option. You also want to think about detention ponds and rain gardens. You want to minimize destruction of wetlands vegetation. This is an example of a flood insurance rate map. What you have, if you see the little white hashed area coming across the bottom quarter and it kind of goes up through, that's what it's called, your floodway. It's an area of flow that will flood before a 100-year flood. Our HUD regs at 55C1 say that if it is a floodway, you cannot use any financial assistance there unless it's a functionally dependent use, and that's like a boat dock or a dam or some wastewater treatment, but not your water plant, because usually you want lower elevation for the treatment and the upper for the water supply. But and also I've had this happen a lot before. People were just like, oh, I'll just put a boat dock on the back of this multifamily project. Now it's a functionally dependent use, right? No, that's just an ancillary use, and we won't allow it. So, while I like people to think creative, don't think creative in a way that's going to jeopardize lives and property. Other areas are the zone AEs, which are, if you look on the bottom left up a little bit, it's the blue shaded above the stripes. And a zone A is basically, it is in fact your 100-year floodplain. That means there's a 1% annual chance of a flood occurring. Well, that seems small on the 1-year basis. I mean, it's around 30% over 30 years. I mean, it's not actually 30% if you actually do the long math, but I don't have that number on me, just trust me. And then the zone A is also 100-year floodplain, but they don't have the elevation established in the study yet. So when you're developing that, you're going to have to get a surveyor out there, and you're going to have to work with FEMA to get your elevation certificate. Below that is a shaded zone X. It's kind of the black and white shaded part, and that's your 500-year floodplain. That's basically going to come into play if you're doing what is called a critical action, which are basically hospitals, emergency response centers, toxic storage facilities, anything that if it floods, you're going to be in a lot of trouble, or it's going to create a giant mess, or basically you're going to have to evacuate them first or fortify it. And there are additional steps in the 8-step process for those. And that is all listed at 5520. That's the 8-step. Something unique to disaster assistance, although we have a proposed rule to try to make this a norm across the agency, is that disaster assistance requires the use of advisory maps. So after a disaster, if FEMA comes out with, am I okay? Does that say audio connection lost? And just keep going? All right, truck on through. Okay, so basically, this came, let's see, Katrina was the first time I experienced it. They instituted what are called advisory base flood elevations. And our regs currently don't require them, but we encourage their use. But in the subsequent Ike notice, we put in language that states, okay, or not, okay, that states that you're required to use them. And they're in the Ike notice at 24M, and on the subsequent notices, they refer back to the Ike notice, so they're incorporated into your notice. It basically says, even if these new maps are not finalized, when you use HUD assistance, you must elevate to the advisory base flood level or the preliminary level. Whatever is the latest map that FEMA has made publicly available, you have to use it. Now, that's not true for your private assistance because that is just subject to your local ordinance. And the local ordinances typically only require finalized maps that have gone through the entire process, where basically the local community will go through a scoping meeting with FEMA, they'll go back and forth, they'll do some surveying, they'll negotiate. Then after the end of the process, you'll get what's called a letter of final determination from FEMA. They say, these are your maps. And then from there, you get 6 months to make them. But that does not apply for disaster assistance. For disaster assistance, we just require the use of the latest maps. And you can usually find those at the FEMA Map Service Center. I believe their website is msc.fema.gov. And you can go to firm maps, which are flood insurance rate maps, and they will have future firms listed as well. 10? All right. All right, now we're going to speed up a little bit. One thing about the flood insurance rate maps is that by statute, FEMA cannot look at future events. So sea level rise, they're not looking at it. Subsidence, not looking at it that much. They are statutorily not required to look at it. There is a flood insurance reform bill that's out there, but with the divided Congress, it's pretty dead right now. So in the Gulf Coast especially, and some on the Outer Banks, you're going to have a lot of subsidence and sea level rise issues because these are low-lying areas, and you should be aware of that. Also, you should be aware of erosion. Washaway Beach, I guess, was not a clever name. It has been eroding at a fast clip, and it is literally destroying the community. North Dakota's Devil's Lake also has a lake that has been growing exponentially and is attacking this community by three sides. So you're going to want to know, you should be aware that the FEMA maps are not infallible. They're just based on the best available data, and they cannot be forward-looking. Executive Order 11990 is wetlands protection. The reason that, I don't know why they're released the same day, but 11989, I guess, is about dirt bikes in national parks. It's unrelated, so just ignore that fact. I guess they like even numbers. The premise is the same for wetlands as floodplains. You're going to want to avoid when all possible, but if you're going to have to degrade a wetland, you're going to minimize that impact. It is a little different than 404 permits from Army Corps because Army Corps permits apply obviously to all funding. This only applies to federal funding. And also Army Corps 404 permits only apply to fill of wetlands, whereas this applies to fill, damming, any obstruction of water or any increase of flow of the water, basically. They're basically new construction activities that are listed under Executive Order 11990. It is not currently codified in the regulations, but we just finished the comment period of a proposed rule that would incorporate that, and we hope to have a final rule out this year. This is a wetlands map. This is John Lafitte, Louisiana. The entire map is basically a wetland except for that little satellite data you see where those are actually paved surfaces. I should have probably used a better map because this whole map is a wetland, but these are just areas where you have to be, where there aren't going to be many alternatives in low-lying areas like this. There's also an asterisk in the bottom that the NWI maps are just to be used for primary screening. If you get a project description that involves a lot of fill and a lot of clearing and a lot of impounding activities where a lot of water flow is going to be impacted, you probably have a wetland on there, and you're probably going to send an environmental expert out there. And you don't necessarily have to pay for them because on our website we have a list of Fish and Wildlife Service National Wetland Inventory contacts, and they'll actually do it for free for you. And we have an agreement with them, and again, I'll show you the site at the end, and you can go there and they'll do it for you, no cost, free of charge. And they'll also consult with you on ways to minimize if you'd like. A lot of minimization strategies are the same, and you can combine the notices and the 8 steps. Basically, your wetlands are what are called the natural and beneficial values of the floodplain. And words like that come out of the guidance that was issued with the executive order. This is the floodplain management guidelines. It was issued around a year after the executive order came out, and it goes more into depth. We have it listed on our website, so you don't have to search around for card administration documents in your archives and museums. And again, for wetlands, you can also do compensatory mitigation as a minimization strategy. That can be fee in lieu. Third time, man, it's getting rough doing this. Okay, fee in lieu mitigation, which is basically you give the state an amount of money and they promise to use it for restoration at a later date. Or you can do compensatory mitigation where you actually buy and create a wetland at another site, hopefully in the same watershed, but not always. All right, toxics. This doesn't come into play as much with single family unless you're on a Superfund site or within, I believe, 3,000 feet of a Superfund site, or have underground storage tank on site. But if you're doing a multifamily project, which again is over 5 units, you're going to have to do a phase one. The phase one review is basically one of these. So this uses Sanborn maps, and it can find like prior uses and what was done to the property before you got there. Because I mean, if it was a refinery, coal storage station, or some other dirty industry, you're going to want to do further review and probably get some phase two soil probe samples. Another option is an EDR, which is environmental data resources, and they have, I guess I would say more robust environmental capabilities, but again, it's another environmental option. Okay, so to kind of wrap up, your environmental review record is basically showing your work as your review. It's what keeps you out of court and shows that you did the right thing, and you're all good in the graces of the National Environmental Policy Act and the related laws. Try to include as much information as you can, all of your evidence that you did. And if you do public inspections, like a site review, just write a brief letter saying you did that. I mean, any amount of evidence helps to show that you did your due diligence. You also want to start as early as you can, especially if you know there's historic issues where you don't have to have a 30-day period or floodplain wetlands, or you have to do your 15-day and 7-day notice. Also, if you're doing an EA, you don't have to do your FONSI and notice of intent. And again, just recognize the time constraints. If you have other funds that may expire or something like that, just be aware of that. Maintain your flood insurance and be sure not to spend a dime. Because if you spend your own non-HUD funds, you're going to have to get a waiver, and that's not a fun process. And I dislike doing it as much as you do. And then if you actually spend HUD funds, that project, again, will be ineligible for the life of that property. It's basically dead for that program. And when in doubt, always contact your field environmental officer or regional environmental officer, depending. That's what we're here for. Give us a call anytime. This is the compliance tools. You can go to either Google HUD and ATEC, it's ATEC, or you can go to the HUD front page, go to Topics and Environment, and you'll see this little flower-like logo. You click on it, it lists all the authorities and different guidance on the individual ones. Some even have, like all these, like floodplains has a bunch of guidance documents, a bunch of case studies about good minimization strategies, different examples, like Portland and Chicago, what they have done. Wetlands has the same, a bunch of EPA stuff. There's also a noise calculator, so you don't have to do the longhand noise calculations anymore, and there's a separation distance calculator, which comes into play if you have a facility nearby that's storing flammable liquids or other chemicals. So those tools are there to help, and please use them. If you have any questions, please ask.